So everybody knows that we're in a virtual session, but let me kind of walk through kind of what that looks like and what we're dealing with on the ground here in Richmond. So the General Assembly has had a debate going on for the past several weeks leading up to the start of session over how long session would exactly be this year. And just for context, the Virginia Constitution requires a 30-day session during the odd years, or it's every other year. And so this was going to be a short session. Well, since the Constitution was revised over 30 years ago, it has been standard practice for the Virginia General Assembly to extend our 30-day session to a 46-day session. It's still a very compressed timeline, but it is one with which we've been working with for 30 or 40 years. Well, this year, the Republicans decided that they were not going to vote for the extension. Their argument for that was, we just concluded a 80 some odd day special session. They've been in extensive conversations on the budget during that legislative session, so they would not need the full 46 days. Well, as a result, what the Democratic majority in the House and Senate have done was coordinate with the governor, and they will proceed with a 30-day regular session, which started last Wednesday. And then the governor will call the General Assembly, which he has the power to do, into special session for a 16-day special session to get to the 46 days. The procedural resolution that does all of this has put in some mechanisms that make it seamless. So the schedule of events, the calendar, the deadlines for crossover and the last day to file bills, from the outside, everything is going to look like it's a 46-day session. But the mechanics of it is we've really got a 30-day regular session and a 16-day special session. Now, in terms of conducting its business, the House of Delegates is going to proceed how it did in the special session, which is they are going to be entirely virtual. So you have all of the delegates participating via Zoom or some other web platform from their home offices, from their work offices, from their cars we've seen, from their homes. The Senate is meeting at the Science Museum of Virginia, and they are meeting in person in a large auditorium with desks spaced 6 to 10 feet apart and protections in place for COVID-19. Now, their committee meetings are also entirely virtual. So from a public participation standpoint, in both the House and the Senate, it is 100% virtual. And there's no access to the legislative buildings. In fact, unfortunately, today, as I was driving into work and pulled up to my building, which is only a block from the Virginia Capitol, there are significant barricades and fences up around the state capitol and the Pocahontas building, which acts as a temporary General Assembly building. So if there ever was a year for things to be virtual, it seems like a fortunate circumstance that this year nobody has to go to any of our legislative buildings on what has become a very difficult day, I think, for a lot of state capitals. In talking about bills this session, we are still seeing bills trickle in, but the bulk of them have been filed this year to accommodate the slower pace of a virtual legislative session. The House and Senate leaders have decided on a bill introduction limit. That's 7 for the House and 12 for the Senate. So far in our legislative session, we have a little over 1,000 bills have been introduced. We might see another 40 or 50 bills get introduced this week. And when that's all said and done, that'll be about half the number of bills that typically get introduced in a short session. So the good news is we have less bills to deal with, both good and bad, starting to really come out as we in our office are participating and Emily's participating in committee meetings where there is a very limited amount of time for public testimony And when you have the ability, in a very good way, for people all over the Commonwealth to testify on bills, it also creates a condensed time frame that we as a society and others who need to advocate in front of the General Assembly, less time for us at the podium. And this is common for all types of entities that are lobbying at the General Assembly. So while we have seen, some great steps forward in transparency, it definitely presents some challenges on those groups that have a more established presence within the General Assembly in front of committees. So that's kind of an overview and a snapshot of what the 2021 General Assembly session is going to look like and how it's shaped up so far. Emily, want me to kick it back to you?
Yeah.
All right.
So, as Patrick has talked about, we're dealing with a very different type of legislative session, a condensed time frame with some strategic and logistical challenges presented. And so what we've chosen to do as the VSCPA is really focus our legislative efforts this year on two key items to the extent that we possibly can. Now, what this does not mean is that, it doesn't mean we're going to ignore other pieces of legislation that come up that we need to chime in on and speak up on, but we have two top priorities that we will spend the majority of our resources and efforts on. The first one is conformity to the CARES Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And then the second one is COVID-related liability protections for businesses. Both of those are issues we've heard significant feedback from our membership about, and so we wanted to make sure that we're focusing as much as we can on those two issues. So on the tax conformity front, we have our usual tax conformity legislation that's introduced by the chairs of the House Finance and the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee, respectively. And as of this moment, the bills that are introduced match each other and they match the budget. They both advance the date of conformity to December 31st of 2020. They conform Virginia to the individual provisions of the CARES Act, but they deconform with the business provisions of the CARES Act. Now, it is our understanding that a substitute is going to be introduced in House Finance later this afternoon that deals with the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And generally speaking, they plan to pick up the majority of the tax provisions included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act. However, the issue that I expect to be the most controversial for our membership is related to the deductibility of PPP and EIDL loan expenses. The administration is recommending that Virginia deconform from those provisions in the event that the loans are forgiven. And then they do plan to put in place a permanent deconformity with the reduction in the medical expense floor. So the challenge that we have is what we do every year, that this is emergency legislation. It requires 80% of the legislature to approve it, and that's 80% in each chamber, so not 80% overall, and that's an important distinction. But if they successfully pass the bill as an emergency bill, then it does become effective immediately upon the governor's signature, and that's what allows us to have that retroactive effective date and tax season to proceed somewhat normally. And so of course we're going to support this bill. I do think from what I'm hearing that, again, it's going to be a lengthy conversation and uphill battle on the deductibility of the PPP loan expenses. However, they do plan to allow for the exclusion for loan forgiveness from income. So there are also two bills dealing specifically with the PPP, and one of them is House Bill 1787, which was introduced by Delegate Joe McNamara. He happens to be a CPA and one of our members. And then in the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Chap Peterson. So both bills do create that tax exclusion on the loan forgiveness, so excluding it from income. And then the Senate version includes a provision that would allow the expenses to continue to be deductible even in the case that the loan is forgiven. As I mentioned before, we expect this to be controversial, and while the society is going to support conformity with both of those items, it's going to take a lot of work to have that conversation and negotiate that point. So I threw this in here just for those of you that may not be tax practitioners, because I certainly know not every CPA is, and it's a point that tends to cause confusion both with our legislators as well as the citizens and taxpayers of the Commonwealth. So just to be clear that we're all talking about the same thing. Conformity is really about adopting the federal definitions of income. So for individuals, this is the federal adjusted gross income, and for businesses, this is federal taxable income. And because we are a static or fixed date conformity state, we have to pass this legislation annually to bring our tax code up to date. If they don't pass that bill, our tax code will remain frozen as it existed on December 31st of 2019. We also have a standing position with relation to conformity, and you may remember in some years past, we talked about trying to accomplish rolling conformity so that we don't have to go through this process annually. And while the society does still support rolling conformity, and we would like to see that be put into place at some point in the future in Virginia, we do not believe that it's likely to happen this year during this legislative session. So just to kind of further this point, because again, this tends to be our biggest issue that we deal with during session, if we cannot get conformity done, it is going to require significant adjustments to returns, essentially would require preparing the federal return twice so that you could file it properly at both at the federal level, but also start at the right place at the state level. If they were to pass the legislation, but not via emergency, then we have a whole nother problem, which is that normally legislation in Virginia takes effect on July 1. So if the General Assembly is not able to pass the emergency bill to make the conformity legislation effective immediately upon the governor's signature, then we're looking at a tax law change mid-year, which could create delays as taxpayers want to wait to file their returns until the new laws take effect. It's going to create challenges for the software companies and the tax department as they process returns. It could affect the timing of revenue, and it could also require a significant number of returns to be amended if they're filed prior to the new laws taking effect. So I also wanted to share a couple of additional pieces of legislation that the Society is supporting this year. I mentioned rolling conformity earlier, and that is what House Bill 1787 does, is it would make Virginia a rolling conformity state. It puts a stopgap measure in place to say that if the revenue impact is greater than 0.25%, that the conformity wouldn't automatically take place, and it would cause the General Assembly to have to go back and review provisions that hit that threshold. Again, we don't anticipate this bill being successful this year, although we will be indicating our support of it. House Bill 1956 deals with changes in the timing of when late payment penalties can be assessed. At this point in time, there's really, if you take the extension to file and pay, there's no way to incur anything other than the maximum penalty. So this would change the timing of when the late payment penalty can be assessed and hopefully provide some better equity there for the taxpayers. House Bill 1999 would give the tax commissioner the authority to waive the accrual of interest when the governor declares a state of emergency. This one is important because you may remember last spring when we were dealing with the extension of the filing deadline, that the one piece that the governor couldn't do via executive order was abating the interest accrual. And they had to pass a special budget amendment in the reconvened session to achieve this. So therefore, if they are able to pass this legislation, that would create the authority for that to be done in certain situations moving forward without needing that extra step. And then lastly, we have House Bill 2060, which if passed would require the Department of Taxation to create an online portal to allow taxpayer information to be accessible to tax practitioners holding a valid power of attorney. And we think that this would just be a positive step for Virginia to take to make this information more accessible. It should streamline operations at the Department of Tax and make you better able to serve your clients if you are a tax practitioner. I mentioned earlier that one of our other priorities is working on immunity as it relates to liability issues for the COVID-19 pandemic. And House Bill 2143 would accomplish this. It creates a pretty narrow set of circumstances under which the immunity would be available. It presumes that employers follow all of the relevant federal, state, and local guidance and policies and procedures, and then permits a limited liability for them. I believe the bill also has a sunset date, so it would not make this a permanent change, but just to kind of get us through this time of the pandemic when that's a concern until we achieve a better level of immunity and control over the virus. So I'm going to turn things back over to Patrick now to talk about the next bill.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So an interesting bill that we haven't seen in the past, a version of this, House Bill 2259 from Delegate Scott, who's a Democrat, would allow the governor to issue a professional or occupation license to anyone who has been denied by their regulatory board. There are no conditions, there are no other parameters associated with a gubernatorial approval of a license application. So this is something that we strongly opposed, and we've been pointing out some of the health, safety, and welfare concerns with a bill like this, and particularly in the case of CPAs, and I also represent the statewide associations for architects and engineers. And so when you get into these professional associations and the professions that really have a high bar to licensure that involve both education and experience and continuing education, the health, safety, and welfare impacts are far more significant on the public than even perhaps some of the more traditional trades. So I really don't see this bill going anywhere. I've spoken to the chairman of the General Laws Committee and the subcommittee chairman who would hear this bill, and without going into detail about our conversation, I will say that both agree that this is not the right policy position. So we've had to weigh in on this bill. All right.
So as far as the other types of issues that we're monitoring, and we'll speak up if necessary, Patrick just talked about a regulatory reform bill, and we'll continue to watch to make sure that there are no other regulatory reform bills that would have a negative impact on CPAs or your practice mobility. We also carefully monitored the procurement space to make sure that there continue to be qualifications-based selection process for the procurement of professional services, which is where CPA services would fall. And then over the past several years, we've seen a real uptick in the human resources issues space. That includes things like mandatory paid leave, the ban the box legislation that we've seen on and off for several years, and things like that.
Yeah, Emily, I might just mention on this slide, this is probably the first year, and again, I don't want to count our chickens before they're hatched here, but this is the first year that we haven't had to deal with procurement legislation that would change how accounting services are procured by the state, which is good. Hopefully that stays the case through the rest of the week. I do want to touch on the human resources issues. You know, one of the really big debates that's going on in the General Assembly is how to provide for sick leave or family leave for employees, particularly in light of COVID-19, and what happens if you have to take care of a loved one, or if you have to quarantine and can't come into the office and you have a job that requires you to physically be present. So that's been a very interesting debate to watch. And the two general models that are out there are a statewide paid family medical leave program that would be run by the Virginia Employment Commission that would require employers and employees to contribute into that program. And by the way, if you run a firm or if you work at a firm that has their own policy, they would have to abandon that policy. There's no exemption for you to keep what you have if it meets the requirements of the law. So then everybody would be in a single system. That model does not have the votes to pass this year, at least the way I read things with those who I'm talking to. There is a second model that is mandating a certain number of hours for PTO or sick leave be accrued for every employee based on the number of hours you work. That will be the more interesting model to watch. So I just wanted to point those out, Emily.
Thanks, Patrick. And we will keep an eye on that and keep you all informed as to how that conversation is going and what the impact might be on your firms or companies. Patrick, this one is also you.
Got it. Emily, I'm going to cover this one and then I'm going to have to drop because Senate Commerce and Labor is getting started.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Yeah. So another big policy issue in front of the General Assembly this year is the legalization of recreational marijuana. There has been one bill filed in the Senate, and there's been actually one bill in the House, but we know that that won't be the vehicle. There will be another bill that gets filed, and these bills come from previous efforts, but what's changed this year, in addition to having a Democratic majority, is also the governor is now supportive of legalizing recreational marijuana. At a very high level, public access to recreational marijuana would not be legal until January 1, 2023. So the way the bill works is between the effective date of July 1 of this year and January 1, 2023, the governor would put together a couple of boards to get regulations in place. The Virginia Alcoholic and Beverage Control Authority would be the entity responsible for developing the regulations. There would be a licensing scheme that would involve creating licenses to grow, distribute, manufacture, sell at retail, and inspect legal marijuana. And so we're keeping an eye on this legislation. We know that there could be potential impacts to your clients or potential impacts to new clients in the future that are associated with this. One of the things that is in the bill is, which I think is actually a really good thing, and we're going to dig into this a little bit deeper, but the bill establishes a work group to look specifically at issues for financial institutions. And so we're going to want to make sure that issues that matter to the society and to you as practitioners, I know Emily will probably be reaching out very shortly to get some input on that language, but we're also looking to find out more information from the governor's office on what type of issues that they want this work group to look at. So that will be a great venue for us without weighing in on whether we should have legal marijuana or not. That'll be a good way for us to weigh in on issues that involve the practical matters for your businesses working with potential clients in this space. And at this point, it's tough to tell whether this bill would pass this year. Certainly having the governor's support is going to move the needle. I think kind of from where I sit and looking at the votes, this will probably get out of the House. There's a good chance it will pass the Senate. And really what I'm hearing from some of the senators who are on the fence about supporting this bill or not is they are supportive of it in concept, but they are very concerned that a 200-page bill, which is where it's at right now, 200 pages, can be appropriately considered in this short session. So they support legalization of marijuana, but they don't want to rush things, and they want to make sure they get it right. And if they don't feel like they can get it right this year, they're not going to vote for it. So that's what the deciding factor is going to be, really, I think, on votes in the Senate. So with that, Emily, Stephanie, everybody, thanks for having me join. I'm sorry I have to drop, but we've got a committee meeting starting in a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions that you may have, either about the legislation that we've talked about, the how session is working, what we're hearing, anything like that. We're happy to take your questions. You can either just chime in, or you're welcome to also put them in the chat.
Emily, this is Art. I have a couple of items. One is on the conformity bill. In the Consolidated Appropriations Act, they extended the period of forgiveness of the expenses and the loan into 2021. So your 24-week period can overlap January 1 up through around June 30th of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do conformity as of a fixed date, as of the end of 20, then what happens if the loan gets forgiven in 21? I don't know if anybody is considering that.
So actually, Art, I think that it's okay because of the actual way the statute reads, which it says that Virginia conforms to the Internal Revenue Code as it existed on a specific date. So by having a date that is after the adoption of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, unless we specifically deconform with provisions, it should pick up anything that was included.
Okay. I mean, because I know that's a concern. Our legislature here in Georgia is in session, and that's a concern at their legislative session as well, because
Sure.
we do fixed date conformity here also.
Right, and it is tricky. It depends on the actual wording of it.
Yeah. It's not really clear in the federal statute. I got to tell you that. I've read that CAA provision a number of times, and it isn't real clear there either.
Sure. Well, I know that they have done the revenue forecasts, assuming all of the above. So they're assuming that they'll be conforming, at least with the loan forgiveness side, regardless of when the loan forgiveness takes place. So we did have a question about how we can observe sessions virtually, and thank you, Vivian, for providing that link. All of the sessions, committee hearings, subcommittee meetings, et cetera, are available via live stream, and then you can also access them as through the archive of any meeting that was recorded, which at this point is going to be all of them. So if you go to the General Assembly website, you'll click on session, and then there's prompts there to drive you to the live stream information.
Emily, I'm putting in the chat right now about the links to the House meeting schedules, as well as the one to the Senate meeting schedules, so that you all can actually, they're very, obviously there's different meetings for different committees, but you're actually able, and subcommittees, and they'll show you that right there, you'll be actually able to see that. You'll be able to click on the links directly for the schedules, as well as the links to the live and archive video are at the top of the page.
Thank you for doing that, Vivian. I appreciate it.
I'm going to get the House one here in a second. I mean, Senate one here in a second.
I would add as well that with everything being virtual, one of the improvements that we've seen is that you have the ability now to submit written comments on any piece of legislation. And that happens prior to the committee hearings for which those bills are docketed. So that is a new thing that we didn't previously have in Virginia, although you always can email legislators with any information that you want to share with them. But to speak during committee hearings, there's a whole separate sign-up process that we haven't had to use before. And all of that is online as well and tied directly into that meeting schedule that Vivian mentioned.
Emily, do we know when the bill that will be related to the conformity, when that will be when that will be voted on, and what day?
Actually, Bob, we do, or we hope we do. So this afternoon, during the House Finance meeting at 1 p.m., they will hear the House Conformity Bill, the House PPP Bill, and the House's rolling conformity bill. So I am signed up to testify on those 3 bills this afternoon.
Okay, great. Yeah, good luck to you.
Thank you. And then beyond that, I would anticipate the Senate will follow suit and have a bill hearing on their conformity bill this week as well. So it's just a matter of which day they docket it for. And we usually don't get that information until about 24 hours beforehand.
Okay, Emily, this is Art. In Georgia, they dealt with the liability issue last year. And the Department of Revenue and the Department of Employment, I think it's called, but the state legislature already dealt with limited liability for employers regarding the COVID-19. So I don't know if you've seen that. If you've not, then I'll be happy to send you a copy of that as well. I'll do a link to that so you have it in front of you. Because somebody might ask, what have other jurisdictions done? And
Sure.
Georgia has already dealt with that last year.
Okay, well, that would be very much appreciated if you would share that, Art.
Okay. And then
Virginia definitely did not deal with it last year, and I'm not sure whether they'll actually deal with it this year as well. They tried to do it during special session and there was a lot of disagreement about the best way to do it. So we're gonna optimistically support the bill that was introduced, but we shall see how that plays out.
Okay, I'll do that later today. And
Are
then
there other questions from others that we have here that I know we want to talk about something other than tax conformity, or maybe we don't?
So we have one here that says, I'm not sure I understand Virginia's interest in PTO, sick leave regarding exposure, et cetera, when it isn't the federal government allowing reimbursement to businesses via CARES Act.
I
And
don't see that question, but
it's in the chat.
okay.
Or maybe it came
To you.
It came straight to me.
Yes.
That's a tough one to answer. I think, you know, that's almost more political than anything. You know, there's been a lot of focus in Virginia over the past year or so on the labor side, more so than the commerce side. And I think that is a big piece to that conversation, and you know, is more of an attempt to accomplish this on a more permanent basis. I think so, not just specifically related to COVID, but to try and get some of these things in place more universally on a permanent basis. So we will continue to watch it though, for sure, and share information as it becomes available to us. So any other questions or comments before we wrap things up? Okay. Well,
I just have one, Emily.
Okay.
The voter voice went out yesterday or today. If you all have had an opportunity to get that information on advocating for quick passage of the tax conformity bill, we'd appreciate your help on getting that done. Not always do our legislators understand the need for the emergency legislation. So if you can take just a few minutes and contact your legislator, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, it actually has gone out so far just on social media. We didn't have the link live last week when our session watch email went out, but what we can do is we can certainly send a link to that to everybody that is registered for this event so that you can get that out sooner rather than later, because it is moving quickly. You can also just go to our website, vscpa.com/voter-voice, and any active campaign that we have going on will be accessible to you there as well. And it is kind of a constantly moving target. We update them as frequently as we need to make sure that there's current information at the right stage of the process. All right.
Emily,
Yes.
thank you. Since I'm not seeing any more questions, I'm going to remind everyone that we are recording this session in case you want to share it with anyone else or review any of it. We'll have a recording available. We will send that out to you tomorrow, along with a reminder email of tomorrow's session, which is at 11:30 a.m. and it's with Secretary of Finance Aubrey Lane. I think he is going to go into more detail about some of the provisions from the governor's and the administration's perspective on the CARES Act and conformity. So you can watch him live and interact and ask questions with him tomorrow. We'll be recording that as well if you need to miss it. And then lastly, we have our conversation with elected officials, which will be going out to you on Wednesday morning. And with that, we just want to thank everyone. I want to thank you, Vivian, for joining us today. Emily, thank you for presenting. Thanks to Patrick as well. And we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Thank you.